Welcome everyone to this webinar on the Global Peace Index. My name is Yusuf Mahmoud. I am Senior Advisor at IPI. It has become almost right to say that the world is at a critical juncture. Political instability, social unrest, ecological and climate threats, rise in geopolitical tensions, and now the COVID are often cited among other woes as the new normal of the times we are living in. So to speak about peace in this context might sound somewhat Pollyannish. Not that we understand what peace is. Many of us have tied its fortunes to the presence or absence of violent conflict. Very few of us have studied it directly or focused on it as a tangible measure of human well-being and progress. And that brings me to the purpose of today's webinar, which is the launch of the 15th edition of the Global Peace Index, published by the Institute for Economics and Peace, or IEP. To walk us through the findings of this year's report is Steve Kilalea, founder and chairman of IEP. Steve founded the Institute for Economics and Peace in 2007 as an independent, not-for-profit global research institute dedicated to shifting the world's focus to peace as a positive, achievable goal. Steve is a consummate system thinker, and thus much of the Institute's work analyzes the intertwined relationships between business, peace, and economic development. If you are interested to know more about how Steve got to be a peace entrepreneur, among other achievements, I invite you to read his fascinating book, Peace in the Age of Chaos. Steve will speak for about 25 minutes, after which I will give the floor to the other distinguished speaker we've invited today, Ayaka Suzuki. Let me also briefly introduce Ayaka. Ayaka is currently the director of the Strategic Planning and Monitoring Unit in the Executive Office of the UN Secretary General. Prior to joining the Secretary General's front office, she served as the Chief of Staff of the Department of Peacekeeping Operation and Department of Field Support, since then they have changed names, at the UN headquarters in New York. Ayaka has held equally challenging positions, both at headquarters and in the field. There are far too many to mention. Suffice it to say that for me, she epitomizes what an international civil servant should be. Ayaka will speak as a discussant for about 10 minutes. I've asked her to kindly share with us her thoughts about the findings of the report, with particular focus on their policy implications for the UN's work. Some quick housekeeping words before we start. I wish to invite our audience to pose questions throughout the event. If you are joining us on Zoom, you can use the question and answer feature. For those joining us via our social media platforms, you can pose your questions in the comments section. We will be monitoring these questions, and we will do our best to address as many of them as the time allows. And so without further ado, it's my pleasure to give the floor to Steve Kilalea. You have the floor, Steve.
Thank you for the introduction, Yusuf, and looking very forward to the presentation. So what I've got is a presentation here. I'll just now share my screen, run the presentation up. This is a very fast-paced presentation. So as Yusuf said, I'll probably be talking for about 20 to 25 minutes. but it'll be a lot of content, and so it'll be very, very fast. So without more to do, here we go. So the Institute for Economics and Peace, it was set up to understand the intersections between business, peace and economics, with a special emphasis on metrics to measure peace and then to ascribe an economic value to changes in peace. We're located in 6 different parts of the world, headquartered in Sydney, Australia, have offices in Brussels, The Hague or Den Haag, Harare, Zimbabwe, Mexico City and New York, where this is coming from today. The Institute works with with all the major multilateral organisations, and we've done contract research and done work for the OECD, Commonwealth Secretary, World Bank, United Nations, just to name some. The work now is included in thousands of university courses around the world, and in any one year we get over 500,000 download loads of our reports. And that's from our sites, and so the number's probably 4 times, 5 times that, because it also gets downloaded from other places. Put a lot of emphasis on media, and including the launch of this Global Peace Index. And in the last 12 months, we had 24 billion media impressions, about 1.2 billion social media impressions with coverage in 152 countries. Last year, we published 12 reports. We're now referenced in over 6,000 books, and in the last 12 months had about 1.4 million visitors to our website. So that's enough of the promotion on IMP. Let's get on with the index. Now, a little bit of background on the structure of the index. So we're now at the 15th year of the index. So that gives us a great timeline to work with. We cover 163 countries and independent territories, and that covers 99.7% of the world's population. The index is comprised of 23 indicators, which got a weighing of 1 to 5. The index itself is actually developed by the Institute for Economics and Peace, but we do have an expert panel, international panel, which oversees the structure of the index, looking at sort of what indicators we use and also what the weighings should be. The index itself is constructed of 3 different domains, and I'll go through those 3 domains now. First one is the measures of ongoing domestic and international conflict. It contains 6 indicators. With next domain is internal safety and security. That has 10 indicators. And finally, we have the final domains, militarisation, which consists of 7 indicators. So these 3 domains come together to create the Global Peace Index. The beauty of this is we can break this out into each of these 3 domains, and you get quite different outcomes when you start to analyse it through the lenses of these 3 domains, because countries become quite peaceful in one and not so peaceful in another, particularly relations between, let's say, internal safety and security and militarisation. So let's now move into the key findings from this year. So this is a map of the world where green is very, very good, red is very, very bad. So if we have a quick look at this, what we'll find is the most peaceful area of the world is the East and Western Europe. And you'll find that there are other areas of Asia which are quite high, as is North America. So parts of North America, Canada in particular. Now, if we also look at where we've got most of the red, Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East and North America. Now, we look in the last 12 months, peace deteriorated by 0.07%. And that's the 9th deterioration in the last 13 years. Now, 0.7% is only a very slight decrease, but you can't really wrap your mind around that. But if we look at the number of countries, we actually had 87 countries improve and 73 countries deteriorate. What that highlights that when countries deteriorate, the deteriorations are much bigger than the improvements. So improving peace generally is a fairly gradual process, whereas deteriorations can happen very quickly. If we look at the changes on the index, the biggest improvements were in ongoing conflict. That was the deaths through conflict and the internal and number of internal conflicts and the intensity of them. Terrorism also improved, which is now a trend which has been going on for some period of time. Deteriorations were driven by deteriorations in the militarisation domain, particularly military expenditure as a percentage of GDP, but also we found a civil unrest as represented through demonstrations, and political instability also deteriorated through the year, and with COVID-19 exacerbating that. So a little bit more detail. So the indicators with the largest deteriorations were violent demonstrations. 3 times more countries fell than improved. And this continues a 10-year trend now. Political instability, where we found twice as many countries deteriorated as improved, and then militarisation, where 97 countries deteriorated. And that I'll come to a little bit further on, but it's a reversal of a prior trend. So if we went back the last decade, militarisation had been improving, and then sort of if we looked over the, let's say if we looked at military expenditure as a percentage of GDP, and we looked over the prior decade, 90 countries improved. But in 2020, 104 countries deteriorated. That's how strong the turnaround was. Now, offsetting it, but not quite offset enough so that the whole index is positive, we had improvements in the deaths from internal conflict, the number and intensity of internal conflicts. And I think probably what's very pleasing is terrorism now improved for the 6th consecutive year in a row. So that's very, very good news. We go to the top of the index. Iceland is the most peaceful country in the world and has been for many, many, many years. Ukraine and Iraq had the largest improvement. I'll talk a little bit more about the Middle East a little bit further on. So the Middle East also had the largest regional improvement of anywhere in the world. 3 regions improved. The other 6 regions, because we covered 9 regions, deteriorated. The other 2 that improved was Europe and South Asia. So now Europe remains the most peaceful region in the world, and it had a very slight improvement. That was mainly on the back of improvement in the terrorism indicator, but it did deteriorate in political stability. So that fell during the period. Now, if we come to the other end, Afghanistan remains the world's least peaceful country. However, it did have a small increase in peacefulness. That increase was driven by slightly less battlefield deaths and also slightly less terrorism. What we find from our research that 90% of all deaths through terrorism actually occur in a conflict zone. Burkina Faso and Belarus recorded the largest deteriorations globally. Burkina Faso on the back of the conflict there, Belarus on the back of a fall with neighbouring relations, and that's with the EU. It also recorded increases in violent demonstrations and increases in its levels of political and decreases in political stability as well. North America, the region you all reside in, had the largest deterioration. Now, if we look at the region, it only consists of 2 countries. Canada, which had a very small improvement, very, very slight, and then obviously the United States, which had decreased. It dropped from the 120, it dropped 2 places to 122. And that was on the back of increased violent demonstrations and increased political stability, which relates back to the last election, and then the issues with the handover of power to the new administration, occupation of the Capitol Hill, and demonstrations around Black Lives Matter and others. Now, let's have a look at the 10 most peaceful countries in the world. What's striking about this is that 8 of the 10 countries actually reside in Europe. That's the most we've ever had on the index. Generally, it's about 6, sometimes 7. Singapore fell out of the top 10. It was 8, and now it's 11, and Ireland's come in to take its place. Now, around this level of the index, the scores are not very far apart. So Singapore fell out on the back of higher military expenditure as a percentage of GDP and higher exports of weapons. If we go to the other end of the index, we find you've got Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, South Sudan, and Iraq at the bottom. If we look at this bottom 10, everyone other than Russia is actually involved in some sort of conflict. Now, but there's good news in this. So if we look at the bottom 5 countries, other than Afghanistan, other than Afghanistan, which is South Asia, the rest of them are situated in the Middle East and most of them are situated in the Middle East and North Africa. Now, 4 of those 5 countries actually improved in this year's Global Peace Index, which underpin the increase in peacefulness in the Middle East. And hopefully, we'd see this as a trend which continue, particularly Syria, Iraq, and Libya also, since the peace agreement which has been reached there, and hopefully Afghanistan should improve as well. And I'll come to a slide on in a minute which will talk about this a little bit more. So if we look at it, the largest improvements came in the Ukraine, Iraq, Poland, North Macedonia and Vietnam. If we look at the largest deteriorations, they were in Burkina Faso, Belarus, Honduras, Zambia and Azerbaijan. Now, I'll talk a little bit about COVID and peace, because a lot of people are interested in the impact COVID had on peace. And the impact was varied. So some ways it was good, other ways it was bad. So if we look at it in the very early stages, what we noticed was that most forms of violence fell. So violent crime, homicides, demonstrations, they all improved during the early part of the lockdown. But as 2020 moved further on, what we found is they all came back to their pre-pandemic levels. So now civil unrest, it was up 10% in as measured through violent demonstrations. So it was up 10% in 2020. Now there were roughly 15,000 different demonstrations, and this continues a 10-year trend, which I'll come to further on. There were over 5,000 incidences globally related to COVID, and I'll show a map in the moment which will show the distribution of that around the world. And so what we found is that although initially after the lockdowns were in place, many countries then started to have various violent incidences related to COVID, which were either against the lockdown or other measures. Political instability deteriorated in 46 countries. That was exaggerated by the economic impact of COVID and also the lockdowns. As I've mentioned, that was twice as many countries deteriorated as improved. The long-term impact of the pandemic on homicides, violent crime, suicide is still unclear. Homicides have been improving quite strongly over the last decade. We expect that probably to keep up, but it will have impact on violent crime. And we certainly believe that the economic conditions which are going to exist out over the next 2 years will fuel further civil unrest as expressed through violent demonstrations. We'll see further political instability. So COVID-19 we see as being a multiplier into existing issues. So I've mentioned that these violent demonstrations have been increasing globally for 10 years, and I'll come to a little bit more of that in a few minutes. Now, if we're looking at COVID-19 related violence incidences, red, this is a map of the world for 2020 through to April 21. You'll notice that red is very, very bad. Where you see the grey, there were virtually no incidences. You'll note that Australia, New Zealand, which have got very, very few COVID cases, fit into that, as does Canada and Saudi Arabia. You'll notice that India was the worst affected country by COVID and also had the highest number of demonstrations. You'll also note that the democracies in Western Europe and in the US were other areas where most of the incidences have occurred also. Now, when we look at what will happen going forward, we believe the economic recovery, which is starting to come underway now, will be the key factor to determine whether civil unrest increases or stays and political stability increases. So a lot depends on this economic recovery. What we have found is that countries with higher levels of positive peace are better placed to recover from the pandemic. So positive peace is described as the attitude, institutions and structures which create and sustain a highly peaceful societies. And this is another body of work from IEP. I won't go into the details of it here, but there's a little bit more on it further on in the presentation. We did an analysis of OECD countries. And what we found is the countries which were highest in positive peace achieved better economic results. And we measured this through unemployment, where the unemployment rates were under 7%. We compared that to the rates of the countries with the lowest positive peace in the OECD, and where the unemployment rates were up to 23%. So that's a stark difference. We also did an analysis to look at what countries are probably best placed to recover. And in that analysis, obviously, we've used these positive peace measures. But we've also brought in the levels of debt within the country and a couple of other financial factors as well. Lower levels of debt mean that countries have more room to be able to stimulate the economy. So now let's look at some of the trends in peace over the last decade. So if we're going back 15 years here, this gives you an idea of the change in score on the Global Peace Index. The higher it is, with the bar in red, the worse it is. If we look at the table underneath, we'll give you an idea of which years have changed. And you'll note that we've only got 3 years where it changed and one where it stayed flat. Now, you'll also note that the biggest change was at the height of the Iraq War. That was only a 1% change in the levels of peacefulness globally. So even though through the news, we perceive that there's these big ebbs and flows in peacefulness, when it's averaged over the countries in the world, the changes still are fairly small. So if we look at it over the last 15 years, the world has actually become about 2% less peaceful. That's something like 86 countries improving in peace, and 87 countries improving in peace and 85 deteriorating. So it's finely balanced. But if we look at the extremes, what we find is there's a growing inequality in the levels of peace globally. So if you look at the blue bar here, what we can find is the most peaceful countries are slowly becoming more peaceful, yet the least peaceful countries are becoming less peaceful. But if you look at the red line, what you'll notice is a change in trend in the last 12 months. And that is seen through the increases in peacefulness in 4 of the 5 least peaceful countries in the world. And it's quite likely that trend will continue over the next couple of years, particularly with the peace recently negotiated in Libya, and hopefully some sort of ceasefire of peace which may come in Yemen in the next 12 months. So we may start to see a reversal of that trend. One of the things I'd comment is countries which are very, very peaceful, right at the top, it's very sticky. They only ever have small drops in peace. It takes a long while to really deteriorate. Where the least peaceful countries, once they're caught in a conflict trap, again, as we all know, it's very, very difficult to get out of. So I'm now going to move through the 3 domains of the Global Peace Index. And this is the average score for countries around violent demonstrations. And we'll see how it's rising over time. We also, which we all know, the number of the displaced people has increased in the last 15 years. It's the number of people have doubled. But on the brighter side, we can see that homicide rates have been declining from 8 per 100,000 people down to about 6.5 per 100,000 people. If we now just look at civil unrest, and this gives you an idea of just the number of demonstrations and how they've increased over time. So 251% increase in the last decade. This is for a whole range of reasons. So talked about the 10% increase last year, and we just look in 2020. So you obviously had the Black Lives Matters demonstrations in the US, COVID demonstrations there as well. But if we went to even countries like Australia or even the UK, you'll see demonstrations there around Black Lives Matters. India had lots of demonstrations relating to the new agricultural laws which they're bringing in there. We've seen Belarus. We've seen what's happened with the coup in Myanmar, for example. If we went down to Latin America, there are many, many demonstrations in many countries there over the economic conditions in those countries. So there's a vast array of reasons why demonstrations are occurring. But this trend, even without COVID, is on a trend which is continuing. There's a number of drivers which are causing that, but haven't got time to get into the detail of it in this presentation. If we look at the ongoing conflict domain, pleasingly, we can see that battlefield deaths peaked in about 2015, have then been continually dropping. But you'll note the number of conflicts kept rising, but in the last 2 years now, total numbers seem to have dropped. So they're much lower level conflicts. But those lower level conflicts, the intensity of them also had been increasing as well. However, we can see in the last year, 2020, that they have actually decreased slightly in intensity. And that's one of the positives in this year's Global Peace Index. Militarisation, what we've had is a 10-year trend where militarisation has been improving, I should say. But in the last 2 years, we can now see that it's deteriorating. This is the armed personnel rates per 100,000 people on average throughout the world. Military expenditure as a percentage of GDP had been falling, but we can now see it's turning. So if we're looking at MILEX expenditure, in 2020, 104 countries increased their military expenditure as a percentage of GDP. So to put that in context, if we went back to 10 prior years, what we found is that 90 countries actually improved in military expenditure as a percentage of GDP. We can see that weapons imports also have spiked in the last 12 months. We think this is a change of trend. This increase in military expenditure and militarisation will keep increasing the next couple of years. A lot of this is fueled by international geopolitical tensions, particularly between Russia, NATO allies, Russia, US, and then issues with China in the Indo-China Sea and its neighbouring countries, and between China and the US. So let's come back and have a quick look at the economic value of peace. So we take a methodology where we've got 18 different variables we use to calculate the cost of violence to the global economy. And it came in at nearly $15 trillion in 2020. And these conservative estimates are conservative. It could easily be up to 50% higher. And that represents 10.6% global GDP, or nearly $2,000 per person. Now, none of us can imagine a world which is totally at peace. But we all can imagine a world where it's, let's say, 10% more peaceful. If we could do that, that would save $1.5 trillion. And just to give you an idea of just how big that is, that's the equivalent of adding 3 new economies to the world the size of Switzerland, Denmark, and Ireland. So these are truly substantial amounts, or it's the size of all foreign direct investment in 2020 as well. Now, if we look at the breakdown of this, the largest component is military expenditure. The second is internal security, and that covers policing, incarceration costs with the criminal justice system, courts and such. Now, we also worked with the Lloyds Foundation out of London this year. They've done some polling. They've asked us on people's perceptions of violence, and they've asked us to sort of do to provide an analysis of it and provide reports on it. So we've got a little bit of that now covered. So if we look at that, 60% of the people around the world actually fear fear from serious harm from violent crime. That's 60% of the people. That's a large number. However, that's the negative. The positive is that 75% of those people surveyed feels as safe or more safe than what they were 5 years ago. And also, there's a difference in the perception by gender. So globally, 5% more women fear being a victim of violence than men. And this varies from country to country. Some countries it's pretty much even. That's particularly true in the Middle East and parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Then other countries such as Switzerland, you can have up to a 20% off difference. So not Switzerland, Sweden, you can have up to a 20% off difference. And also sort of the experience of violence differs radically from country to country as well. So Sweden, for example, 23% of people in Sweden say they have been a victim of violence or know someone who has. So now, being a victim of violence, how does that rate in worries compared to other things such as health, financial worries, economic-related worries, climate? But so being a victim of violent crime or terrorism, in parts of the world, it's the highest risk. That's particularly true in Latin America. But globally, it's the second highest fear people have after being a victim of a road accident. Now, if we look at it now, we start to look at the experience of violence. This is where we ask people, have you experienced violence in the last 2 years, or do you know someone who has? The countries with the highest level are all in sub-Saharan Africa: Namibia, South America, Lesotho, Liberia, and Zambia. The countries with the least experience of violence are Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Japan, Singapore, and Poland. Now, when we ask people where you're most worried about being a victim of violence, Brazil comes up at the top, followed by South Africa, Mauritania, and Malawi and Lesotho. At the other end, the ones where there's the least worry about violence are Singapore, Norway, Tajikistan, Lithuania, and Uzbekistan. So they're down around under 10%. Now, also feelings of safety. How do you feel? Do you feel less safe or more safe than what you felt 5 years ago? So the countries where people feel less safe is Lebanon, Hong Kong, Afghanistan, Venezuela, and Zambia. Where people feel where more people feel safer is in China, UAE, Cambodia, Estonia, and Singapore. If we look where violence is considered the greatest risk to your personal safety, it's Afghanistan, Brazil, South Africa, Mexico, Dominican Republic. None of that really comes as any surprise. If you went to Mexico, it has the 9th highest homicide rate in the world, but the 5 cities with the worst homicide rates in the world all reside in Mexico. Countries where it's the least people see it as the risk are Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, China, and Vietnam. Note, they're all authoritarian countries. Now, this is the last slide, and then I'll be done. So one of the things we've done is we've done an analysis to try and look at what are the countries most likely to fall in peace. And I mentioned this concept of positive peace earlier on, which is the attitude, institutions, and structures which create and sustain peaceful societies. We arrive at that through a lot of mathematical modelling and statistical analysis. Then we've got other models which now look at the actual peace, which is measured through the Global Peace Index, and we'll call that negative peace, which is which we can then use as the difference between the potential for peace and the actual peace to be able to understand what countries are most likely to deteriorate in peace. And so where you've got a big gap there, we call that a positive peace deficit. What we've found is the countries with the largest deficits are the ones most likely to fall in peacefulness in the future. However, quite often you do need a shock to cause this to happen. And this model's really good because it gives you a predicting factor 7 to 10 years out, which means there's time to be able to do things about it. Now, if we look at the 10 countries which had the largest deterioration in peace between 2009 and 2019, in 2009, 7 of them had the largest positive peace deficits. And another angle to come in is look at the countries which had the largest positive peace deficits. And they fell, but they may not have all been in the 10 largest falls, but we found the 10 countries with the highest deficits 90% of them recorded substantial deteriorations in their peacefulness. So that's a pretty good model. And what we find here is the countries now which according to this model are the ones which have the biggest possibility of falling in peace, let's say over the next 7 years. So this does give the ability to be able to look what countries we should be targeting to try and put into place the necessary programs to fix the instabilities there and improve their positive peace measures. So thank you. That's the end of my presentation. So I'll stop sharing the screen now. Back to you, Yusuf. Thank you. You're on mute, Yusuf.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve, for this quite edifying presentation of the main findings. I'm happy that you've touched on the positive piece. I will ask you later on one little question on that. But without further ado, it's my pleasure now to give the floor to Ayaka for her comments. You have the floor, Ayaka.
Great. Thank you so much, Yusuf. And congratulations to you for your publication of a new book. I have a copy and look forward to reading it.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Steve, many thanks for that indeed very edifying presentation. It's so rich with data points and so comprehensive. And I really, for those of you who have not read the report, I highly recommend that you do that. There are three, in commenting on why your work, this Global Peace Index and the index report is so relevant, I want to relate to three buckets of work streams that we're involved in at the United Nations. So first of all, I mean, it's the methodology itself. We consider GPI a best-in-class model, really, for composite indices that give us a comprehensive aggregate view on risks to peace, security, and stability. It's truly phenomenal, and we can all learn from it. And we really feel that this kind of methodology and approach is so crucial as an input into evidence-based decision making. As you know, after the Secretary General, he was just confirmed for the second term. Inauguration is tomorrow, but his first term he ran basically really trying to promote prevention. And to underpin that, he also tried to put in place the evidence-based decision making. And we are trying to support that. And what we're realizing that there's still a lot of gaps in a system to try to make our machinery as robust as we can be in terms of evidence-based and supported discussion. One of the examples that we have, one of the mechanisms that we have improved over the years is a mechanism called regional monthly reviews. It is a risks and opportunities-based discussion, which utilizes a lot of different sources of data, and we would really like to partner up with you in a future. I believe that our colleagues are already in discussion on that, so that we can better target risks, orchestrate much earlier response, and match needs to solutions. Look, what you're doing in this report really resonates with the spirit of the RMRs, which recognize that the peace and stability are just one factor phenomena, but we really need to look across a whole range of underlying drivers of stability. So getting this right is not just a matter of having data, right? I mean, I think we have so much data overload in a way, but it's really about building ecosystem where data, diverse expertise, technology application, and decision-making processes combine in new ways. And in a way, this is something that we're hoping to build in the new phase of UN Operations and Crisis Center. So it's really directly relevant to our work. So thank you for that. The second bucket that I wanted to talk about is related to our common agenda. As most of you watching this webinar may know, in September last year, the General Assembly adopted a declaration on UN 75 and invited the Secretary General to revert to the General Assembly on his thoughts on the future of multilateralism. And we hope that this will be a very influential report, which should be coming out in coming months. And within the context of future of multilateralism, this inclusive network multilateralism, future of peace and security is very much part of that. And when I read the report, when I listened to your presentation, so many of the findings resonate with what the report will contain and will speak to, and I will try to address. Just in interest of time, just to flag two of them that you mentioned that are very much relate to the report, is this whole issue of rising inequality. So that really needs to be addressed, and one of the proposals that we expect that this report's not written yet. It's led by Assistant Secretary General for Strategic Coordination under very close guidance of the Secretary General himself. The reimagining a social contract will be a very much key part of his call for a future of multilateralism. And I think you spoke to that in your presentation. And another thing was the data point on military expenditure was also very, very interesting. And it's also very much part of the new disarmament agenda as well. So, I mean, I'm not going to go into too much into detail because this is still a work in progress. It's still being refined, but when you see this report, when it comes out, you will see that there a lot of the points that you mentioned will be echoed in that. And then finally, I also wanted to mention that this really resonated because it's also directly relevant to the work that we're trying to do in promoting integration within the UN system. And in Yusuf, I know that in your past roles in the UN, you were such a champion and in a way leader in promoting integration and actually embodiment of where integrated approaches can be most effective. For example, in Burundi, right? We'll still talk about that as one of the best examples that we've had. 1 out of every $2 spent by the United Nations system is in these fragile situations. And the finding that you made that overall, there were improvements, but overall peace is deteriorating highlights the growing need for cooperation within and between UN entities in coordination with host countries to counter this trend and then really engage in peace building beyond rhetoric. And so what does that mean? So we really need to look at it. And I really I'm so fascinated by the concept of global the peace deficit, the positive peace deficit. The report also uncovered significant quantitative evidence to support the case for improved integration through expanded cross-pillar analysis and planning capacity. For example, the volatility of country-level peace indicators. It calls for much improved joint monitoring, qualified impacts of certain pillars on others, such as economic impact of violence, emphasizes the need for transparency in joint planning across the pillars, and the harms of premature or uneven development across pillars is perhaps the strongest evidence that institution cannot act in silos in conflict setting. So we fully endorse the report conclusion that the key to building peacefulness in times of conflict uncertainty is positive peace, and as defined as attitudes, institutions, structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. So we really feel that the findings of this report, as very succinctly summarized by you, can inform our work in this area. And just to plug that one of the subset of our work in integration is looking at attitudes of individuals and shared objectives through a new focus on behavioral interventions. So we are including behavioral scientists in the implementation of the findings of this review and integration that we have done. So we'll definitely be be drawing from of the findings that you have done. So yeah, I mean, maybe one last thing that I would say is that that demonstrated predictive power of the positive peace indicators also demonstrate to us that we can do much better in terms of foresight. I already mentioned the RMRs, the regional monthly reviews, and risk scans, but more and more, we're really trying to get to the anticipatory action. I mean, Mark Lowcock in the humanitarian arena has already done that, incorporating it more in deciding when to release the humanitarian funding before it becomes a crisis. So we can also learn a lot from that. Yeah, I mean, in the interest of time, I think I'm going to wrap up here, but this work is really inspirational, and we really feel that that it really underscores the importance of evidence-based transition planning also from the get-go, to ensure that UN priorities and structures mirror those needs at the local level. So I will stop here, and I look forward to hearing observation and comments from members of the audience. And yeah, but really, congratulations on this great work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ayaka. I am happy to hear that there are areas of the ongoing work of the front office, and particularly the 75 report, likely be informed by some of the findings. I am struck by the emphasis on the findings relating to militarization. Clearly, it's not going in the peaceful trend. And more importantly, given that peace is really relational, we need to revisit the social contract. One of the things that struck me from Steve's comments and what I have read is that some people feeling secure because there is a public or militarized public safety, but feeling less and less safe. And this is clearly needs to be revisited. We have very good number of questions and comments that, as I'm sure you have seen. Let me just take maybe the first three and then go through them. The first one is by Michael Corus, addressed to you, Steve. And the first one, it says, did I understand correctly, you asserted that Russia is not involved in conflicts? Syria and Ukraine both have Russian troops on the ground. There may be others. Please do clarify, comment. I'm sure you meant they don't have an internal conflict, but it would be good to clarify that. The second question is for you, Ayaka, and possibly Steve. Last year, the UN Secretary General called for a ceasefire in countries experience conflict so governments can focus on tackling the pandemic. Did this have any measurable impact on peace levels in these countries? I noticed, Steve, this is probably to you, I noticed you've mentioned that some countries have since returned to pre-COVID conflict. Are conflict levels much worse now? What would have been a better, more sustainable alternative? And then I finish with the comments and question by our common friend, Chik Dambach, who says, if fatalities in conflicts declined, but you say intensify, increased, how do you define intensity? So maybe we'll start with these three, and I'll give you the floor, Steve.
Great, thanks. So the Russian one, as you commented, Yusuf, yes, that's exactly right. It's what we're looking at is internal conflicts. In that case, we're really looking at civil wars, probably the best way of looking at. So all those other countries have got some form of what we'd call civil war going on. Russia certainly has engaged in many conflicts beyond its borders, as is, let's say, the US also, and many European countries as well. The second question is probably best handled by Yakasha, but I'll come back to the comments on the conflict and pre-COVID and maybe Chick's one, and then we'll save that one for last. So if we're looking at the pre-COVID environment regarding conflict, what we're seeing is that there is an improvement in conflict. There was a lessening of conflict in the initial days of COVID. We could see that in the drop in battlefield deaths. They have come back up somewhat since then, but still what we're seeing is a long-term, we're seeing a 5-year decline in battlefield deaths. We expect that to continue. When we're looking at the intensity of internal conflict, that's really dependent on the number of people who die within a conflict. So a lot of conflicts can be very low level, where you may have 5, 10 people die per annum in the conflict. That's what we'd use as the measure of intensity. And that combined with the number of conflicts gives an idea of the overall feeling there. In terms of sort of looking forward with the call for by the Secretary General on having a ceasefire of conflicts to be able to affect the to affect, so we can actually tackle COVID as best by Yashaka answering that. But the comment I would say is that I think there are some areas that, although there's increasing geopolitical tensions, particularly in the Indo-China Sea and between, let's say, NATO and Russia in many areas, the major conflicts themselves seem to be improving. And I think the recent peace deal done in Libya is excellent, and we certainly know there's a lot of discussions going on in Yemen. And hopefully if we got on top of that one, I think the overall conflict overall and the peacefulness of the planet would start to improve. So if we took, let's say, the conflicts in the Middle East, the ramification effects from them out of the Global Peace Index for the last decade, then the peacefulness of the world would have actually improved. But I'll pass it over to you, Mrs. Suzuki.
Great. Thank you. So it's a very good question. And I mean, I think that I think everybody would agree that the Secretary General really seized the moment to call for global ceasefire at a time when he thought that this could really, that the worst crisis, one of the worst crises to hit entire humanity, needs to be used as an opportunity to call for a global ceasefire. And look, it has been uneven. That is for sure, right? But I think that everybody knew from the outset that it wasn't going to be light switch you can just turn on and turn off. So it may not be as visible, but the call definitely did create space for, at the very local level, pausing. I think that there were some very early successes, such as in Colombia, when one of the armed groups did voluntarily, unilaterally accept the call. And then there were other small, more local community level examples where it created space for negotiation, pause, etc. But most importantly, I think that a call like that, once again, stressed the need for this whole notion of positive peace that we've been talking about this past hour. Right? I mean, it's the peace is not absence of armed conflict. There's so much more that we need to be working on. So again, he really spotlighted this, but it was done in conjunction with so many other calls that he's done. Simultaneously, I think the Secretary General issued something like 26 policy briefs, ranging from debt relief to vaccine equity and I mean, it's a multifaceted approach. So I think that when you look at, okay, was that meaningful, useful, it has to be looked at as one of the many measures that were also launched at the same time, because again, peace can only be pursued within a broader context of promoting sustainable development goals and to reducing inequality and all of that. So I don't know if it makes sense, but that's really the best answer that I can give on that right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayaka. We have at least 3 more questions. One is from Raju Bhatt. What areas are the global hotspots to look out for? And then the next question, which is really a comment and a question by Lubomir Todorov, it's basically saying that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council who are powerful enough to resolve conflict, and heaven knows they are the most powerful holders of weapons of mass destruction of the 21st century, why can't they resolve to prevent conflict before it happens? I am paraphrasing his question. And then another question from Hector Ferrando Cushman, and he says, I see you have an office in Mexico City. Is there a particular reason to have such an office in this country in particular?
Right, okay, so I might start by answering the last question first. The Security Council one, which I think is a very complex question, is probably better answered by Ayaka rather than me. But then I'd probably be good to hear the UN's thoughts on where the hotspots are as well. So I'll go through what the areas I think which are important. Look, I think one of the areas where we're focusing a lot on here at IEP will be in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa. So we've recently released an ecological threat register, which looks at the ecological threats. We're particularly focusing on food and water and population growth, and now extending that out to 2050. And all those things will be impacted by climate change. It'll be a multiplier. So we're looking up around those areas. The reason for that is the increases level of what we can see is political instability in those areas. We've recently seen, let's say, a coup in Mali. Burkina Faso had the largest fall this year, or in 2020. We're also, when we're looking at terrorism, yes, we do a global terrorism index as well. What we can see there, that the 5 areas in the world where the largest increases in terror, all up in the Sahel and Horn of Africa. And a lot of them are IS chapters or groups which are affiliated with IS. So that's an area which I think we need to take particular interest in. One of the things also feeling into it, which obviously climate change has put a lot of emphasis on it, but it's more than climate change, it's the ecology and like just the whole concept of what is a sustainable planet. And a lot of that comes back to population. So the areas which have got the fastest population growth in the world, the areas of the real concern to us. And again, if we come up into sub-Saharan Africa, particularly Sahel, Horn of Africa, we find that the countries with the highest growth rates in the world are all in that area. So in that area, we've got 7 countries where the population is going to more than double on projected amounts over the next 30 years. Niger's the one which is we're expecting, which on the projections we've got will have the highest population growth, about 120%. But there are other, Nigeria's in there as well. It's the most populous nation. We can see that it's already fragile in many, many different places, although Nigeria did slightly improve in peace this year on the back of a decreased level of the conflict and deaths through conflict. Indonesia would be another highly populated country with large increases in peace, and we can also see it in China as well. Obviously, the Middle East, we can see flare-ups in the Israeli-Palestinian. That has knockover effects, but there have been some advances in terms of the relationships for peace in the Middle East, particularly between Israel some of its Arab neighbours the last 12 months, and hopefully they maintain going forward. I think with Russia and the US, I think the conversations between President Biden and President Putin were constructive. So I think that's really good. If we come back and we look at our Mexico office, why Mexico? Because we do a Mexican Peace Index, which was been originally funded by a rich Mexican family. And we've been doing that now for 7 years. And so it gets a lot of coverage. We also have been doing a lot of training on our positive peace with the Mexican military and the various Mexican police departments as well. So that training, the Mexican Peace Index and the traction it gets are the main reasons why we're in Mexico. Now, as for the Security Council, there are things I could say on it, but I'll probably hand it over to Ayaka, who is obviously more skilled, more knowledge on on its operations.
Thank you, Steve. Ayaka?
Hi, thank you. So in terms of hot spots, I don't really have much to add because, again, we're not really in the business of making lists, right? So I would only say that hotspots are where there are conversions of human-made crisis, political conflict, human rights violations, climate change dangers, humanitarian concerns. And when you combine these, I mean, it's a really recipe for a disaster in a way. So many countries, the administrations that you listed are among those. So we are looking at places where there are multidimensional risks facing these countries. And that's why, using a variety of sources, including our own, to look at whether what the trends are, et cetera. I mean, I think that's really critical. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's not really I think that we just really need to be looking at the risks in a comprehensive manner and in addressing that. And it's also really important not just to be looking at it from risk mitigation perspective, but really to see, well, what's working well and how can we build on that. And that's not something that we've been good at doing, but we're really trying to do that more and more. And that is that is a quite remarkable change from, I think, the previous approaches. And there's one point that I wanted to make, but it just momentarily escaped me. But I'll come to that in the next round if I remember this next point related to focusing on what's working in some of these situations. But maybe I'll just note that some of the exercises that were helping our country presences is exactly this. This is multidimensional risk analysis to help find how do these risks interplay with each other and where the opportunities are that we can build. Oh, I remember the point now. So the point that I also wanted to make is that it's really too late when it becomes a hot spot in a way, when it becomes a crisis, right? So this is also something else that we're trying to do with our RMR and other fora, is to try to rev up the United Nations country level capacity as much as possible, well in advance, before it becomes anything remotely a crisis situation. Because by the time it becomes a crisis situation, then it becomes a Security Council issue, and there's very little that can be done. I mean, when you look at what's going on in some of the Security Council mandated countries that are on the Security Council agenda, it's very little that can be done, partly related to geopolitical realities and such. So it's much more effective to do something programmatically or what have you, years before it becomes a crisis. So in that case, I think the kind of the work that you're doing at IEP is really useful to, and then the work that our colleagues are doing on the ground, the peace and development advisors, resident coordinators and such. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Ayaka. have exhausted the list of questions that were posed. We still have a couple of minutes before maybe I ask you for final comments, Steve and Ayaka. And this is really a question I wish to address to Steve. If I recall correctly, the definition of peace that you have adopted for the Global Peace Index is the absence of violence or fear of violence. What made you move from this negative definition of peace to the positive peace index that you have mentioned, which is more about about the drivers of peace rather than the drivers of conflict?
Oh, thank you for the question, Yusuf. I'll take it as a bit of a leading question, which is excellent. But so look, when we started off, just a personal story. So my background's actually business. I set up a couple of international IT companies, set up a family foundation about 30 years ago, which works with the poorest of the poor. So that took me into a lot of war zones, near post-war zones. I was in northeast Kivu, walking through there, and I wondered what are the most peaceful nations in the world. Searched the internet, couldn't find a list, and that's how the Global Peace Index was born. But for simple businessmen like myself, we walking through Africa and wonder what are the most peaceful nations, and it hasn't been done, then how much do we know about peace? If you can't measure it, can you truly understand it? If you can't measure it, how do you know whether your actions are helping you or hindering you in achieving your outcomes? You don't. So then sort of the difficult part was to move beyond a moral judgment on peace, because the stage when we went back 16, 17 years ago, peace was mainly seen as a moral value. And so I wanted to move beyond that to get something which was measurable. So we used the definition absence of violence or fear of violence, because that was something most people could relate to, and it was something which was tangible and we could measure. And it was something which moved it beyond moral. So let's say we have militarizations within the Global Peace Index, but it's not a moral judgment on the military, because if you're living in violent times, you need it. We can certainly see through the UN, there's been some great UN peacekeeping missions over the years. They've been absolutely vital for peace. But if you've got a large militarization, that's one, because you're in fear of violence from someone else, or you need it to protect your national interests, or alternately you want to use it for coercive purposes. So either way, so it's not a moral, so the idea is it's not a moral judgment, it's something you can measure. Now, having the Global Peace Index, what we realised, it's great to be able to understand the states of peace and violence globally, but that doesn't tell you how to actually create peace. And so what we did then is we've assembled about 50,000 different data sets, indexes, attitudinal surveys. Then we've used mathematical modelling and statistical analysis to be able to now understand what are those factors most associated with peace. We call that positive peace. You can break that up into 8 different pillars or domains. And from there, now you can turn that back round into an index, which we do. So the indicators are mathematically derived, and then even the weighings within the index also mathematically derived, as are the different pillars within the index too, with other statistical techniques for doing that. So what we've got is something which is not the researchers or my bias, but something which falls out through empiric techniques. Now, the power of taking that now and turning it round into an index is you can now start to understand the velocity or movement of countries. So all this works with systems. And we use a lot of systems theory, which I haven't really covered anything in this presentation, but we've got a lot of deep systems theory built into the way this operates. And so, if you like, countries are sort of self-reinforcing systems. They're moving in virtuous or vicious cycles. So that's the country's attitudes, institutions, structure improving or deteriorating. And so now we've got the ability not only understand how countries are standing relative to other countries, but we also understand their philosophy. Are they on virtuous cycles, vicious cycles? And if you can get a country and you can get it into a virtuous cycle, these factors of positive peace are self-reinforcing. They keep reinforcing and moving it in a better and better direction. And similarly, you can see the opposite. When the society is going down, you've got these factors like increasing corruption, increased suppression of free speech and those kind of things, which then sort of move it off decreasing economic conditions if you've got less competitive environments and such, and tied up with corruption. Governments becoming less and less effective. Again, you've got these starts of vicious cycles. But on the other hand, the government's becoming more effective and becoming more accountable, and then you've got moving into a virtuous cycle. But things like, let's say, free flow of information, well-functioning government, lower levels of corruption, strong business environment, they all interact together. And so corruption affects business, business affects corruption, well-functioning government affects corruption and business, but business and corruption can affect well-functioning government, and so can free flow of information interact on all of them as well. So as you can see, this stuff gets deeply embedded in the system.
It's very helpful. Thank you very much. The reason I brought this up is because I see the two indices self-reinforcing each other. If you want to move from a violent world, because violence is usually very visible. I understand why you started there. Peace is always invisible until you lose it, unfortunately. Even though it's the most important intangible in our lives, it's rarely visible. So if you want to move from a violent world to a less violent and definitely more positive peace, you have the policy recommendation in the Positive Peace Index. So I'm glad you've brought these two indices together. Ayaka, any final words before we move on? And then I'll give you a little bit, maybe 1 minute, Steve, to close with final remarks. Ayaka?
No, just to express my appreciation for being part of this panel, and thank you to IEP and you, Yusuf, yourself, for introducing the concept of positive peace. I think it's really a powerful concept and has been overlooked for too long. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Steve, the last word is yours.
Thanks. Yeah, look, I'll make just two very brief comments before we finish up, Yusuf. Yeah, the first one's back to positive peace. So what we've also done is a whole lot of the analysis on, once we've got the Positive Peace Index, on what other factors are associated with positive peace other than peace. And we find that the same factors which create for a peaceful society also create a whole lot of other things which we think are important. So higher per capita income. So countries which are improving in positive peace compared to countries which are deteriorating have 3 times higher annual growth rates in GDP. Like, that's in more per capita income. That's really big. Countries which are improving in positive peace have better outcomes on inflation compared to countries deteriorating, better outcome on inflation, better outcome on interest rates. They're less volatile, usually at about twice as low. Foreign direct investments about twice as big. Countries which are improving in positive peace, their currencies appreciate on the average about 1.3% per annum, compared to countries which are deteriorating on positive peace, where the exchange rates deteriorate. We can see the same thing reflected in sovereign bonds. Can see it also reflected in performance on measures of the ecology. Countries which are high in positive peace do much better on measurements of ecology. Also do a lot better on measures of well-being and happiness, other measures of inclusion. So in many ways, positive peace describes an optimal environment under which human potential can flourish. Now, I've done an awful lot of media interviews in the last 3 days, and it was interesting, and it's a bit different than past years. I don't think I've had this question much in past years, but I've had it 4 or 5 times in the media interviews I've done. Am I optimistic or pessimistic for the future? Okay. And I think that's probably because of the advent of COVID, discussions we've had on sort of the economies, post-COVID recovery and militarisation. So I'm neither highly positive nor highly negative on the future. I'm somewhere in between. I think there are positives in there. There are also negatives. What's really important is that we as citizens of the world try and do the small things we can to try and improve the peacefulness of the world. And bodies like the UN are exceptionally important in working at the macro level in terms of trying to take trying to mute some of these negative trends, but you should never get rid of them entirely. The best you can do is mute them, and then enhance some of the positive trends, because even in the worst of conditions, there's still 1 or 2 positives which are going on.
Thank you very much for those wonderful final remarks, not surprising coming from a system thinker. I'm afraid our time is up, and we bring this to a conclusion by thanking again Steve for this powerful introduction of this year's Global Peace Index, and for Ayaka for really accepting our invitation and sharing with us your insightful comments on this year's Global Peace Index. Thank you, everyone, and hope to see you again. Thanks. All the best.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Ayaka, for all your intelligent and thoughtful comments.